Okay, so comrades, you covered a lot of the dates, and important dates. So in South Africa, there's been a very long history of struggling against exploitation. So it starts way back. Maybe we can add some important dates as well, and just build on some of the dates that your comrades have mentioned. So I'm not going to look at like anti-colonial struggles because they were highly important struggles, but we're going to start in about 1910 when South Africa as a state came about. It's only in 1910 that all the colonies were brought together, that you have South Africa formed. So South Africa as we know it today basically comes from 1910. But there's earlier things, obviously, as we said, the gold mining was started earlier, and that shaped how South Africa looks. So if you remember back, we said that the basis of wealth in South Africa is the exploitation specifically of black workers, the black working class. Very low wages, high unemployment to drive down wages. I don't know if comrades remember we covered that 2 weeks ago. So comrades, we started in 1910. An important date, I think, is actually in 1918. I'm just adding on some of the dates. There was the first black trade union formed, and it was formed down the road. Was called the Industrial Workers of Africa. And it was formed like the ANC was formed. Comrades mentioned the Native Land Act. It was formed to fight partly the Native Land Act like the ANC. So the ANC comes into being to try and fight the Land Act. That's where it originates from. So that's why it came about. It was to try and stop the Land Act being imposed. They used different tactics. Sometimes it was marches, sometimes it was petitions. They also tried to petition the Queen in England, who was still head of the South African state, to say there shouldn't be this Land Act. But this also comes into being to fight that. It comes into being as well to try and fight low wages for black workers. So it's the first organized attempt by black workers. There were strikes before this by black workers, but there wasn't an organization. So this was the first organization that was specifically, it was to try and fight the low wages for black workers. It was also trying to fight the PASS system, because the PASS system was passed, it comes into being with gold mining. So you want migrant labor coming in. And this was actually formed to try and fight that. It eventually joins with other unions to form the ICU. Comrades ever heard of the ICU? No? Okay. So it's the Industrial Commercial Workers Union. Some people put a W in there. But it was actually formed by, one of the leaders was actually a migrant labor from Malawi who was working on the mines, Clemens Kadali. He was one of the leaders, but it was formed out of this, and their aim was also to try and fight for land. They organized a lot of farm workers and farm tenants. So they basically emerged, but they were hit by the state really hard. So the state tries to crush the ICU. And in fact, in its day, the ICU was much bigger than the ANC. It was an important organization, but it was smashed by the state. And it actually disappears. But there's also other events that happened. And one was in 1922. There were white miners and mine workers, and they went on strike. And what they were doing was they were fighting because the mines wanted to introduce black skilled workers and lower wages. So the white mine workers were fighting in order to have job reservation, to say that black workers can't do skilled work. But they were also fighting to try and keep their wages that the mines were threatening to cut intact. And that was actually quite a big strike. The miners were actually racist. The white mine workers were mainly racist. But they fought a big strike. And out of it, there was a revolt by white mine workers in East Rand, in Joburg. They took over police stations. They tried to take over the mines. And the government bombed them with aeroplanes and bombed them into submission. So the next big thing, comrades, happens in 1946. So I'm adding to some of the dates now. And out of this, there was a big strike on the mines by black workers. And they had a trade union. Do you remember the trade union, comrade? I can't remember the trade union. I think it was the African Mine Workers Union. It was linked to the ANC, but they undertook a massive strike they were on the gold mines. And they were also questioning, like the IWA, the pass law system, the low wages for black workers. And And similarly, part of it was also about land. So they had links back to the past. They may not even consciously know, but there were links in terms of what they were fighting for. So they were trying to question the low wages, but the state again managed to crush them, and it was violent. They killed many mine workers, black mine workers. And then, comrades, we have in the 50s, the ANC specifically came into prominence. So we hear about the Defiance Campaign. That was also fighting pass laws. So there's a long history of fighting pass laws, of Group Areas Act. Group Areas Act saying that blacks have to stay in certain areas on the homelands, whites, they stay in the suburbs. So there was a whole long history of struggle around this. And the ANC takes up the anti-pass campaign, and then Nandi covered the Women's March. Out of this, you have a split. The PAC also takes up pass laws. They split with the ANC around the Freedom Charter. They break away and form the PAC. And then obviously in the run-up to Sharpeville, the PAC is mobilizing. And they try and crush the PAC and the ANC, but specifically the PAC doing Sharpeville. I don't know if comrades know of a guy called Philip Kosana. Yeah. Do you want to just explain a bit?
Philip Kosana. At that time, he was only 21 years old. He was a student at UCT. He was here in Cape Town. He led the march from Langa here in Cape Town. That was the biggest one of the biggest march in that 1960. He was only 21 years old, a student at UCT during that time. He led that march of Sharpeville massacre of pass laws here in Cape Town. And I don't just remember the number, but the huge.
Yeah, it was huge. So, comrades, basically what happened was people got shot in Langa.
During that time, he was a national organizer of
PAC. People got shot in Langa at the same time as Sharpeville. And then comrades mobilized, and they came from Langa, I think it was the following day. There were 30,000 people on the march, some say it was bigger. And they marched from Langa into town. You know where Caledon Police Square Station is? You know the Caledon Police Station?
Yeah.
There they met. And the government was worried they were going to storm Parliament, so they called in 13 regiments of the army. And they started putting up defences around Parliament. And Philip Kosana met with the policeman there, and he said that the comrades want the pass law dropped. They want to actually protest against the killing at Sharpeville and Langa. And the police officer said, fine, we can meet with the ministers to discuss this thing. He was trying to diffuse the situation. In the meantime, the government was arming itself around Cape Town. They called up 13 regiments and brought them into Cape Town. Eventually, they say they'll meet him, but they double-cross him and he was arrested after the march. They never met the minister. It was just basically subterfuge. So they try and break the ANC and PAC in the 60s by banning them. And there's heavy repression. So some of the Bram Fischer is part of the South African Communist Party, which is linked to the ANC. You have the treason trials. You have all those trials during the 60s. It's basically to break the ANC and PAC. And what happens is the comrades think, okay, well, look, the state's coming down heavily. So we have to actually do something else. And both decided on an armed struggle. And they launched their armed wings. It turns out to be, it was difficult for those comrades at the time, but in hindsight, it wasn't the best strategy. But they faced repression, so they said, okay, we don't have an option, we have to do this. So they launched their armed wings, and there was a big protest in Paarl by the PAC armed wing, and there were like 250 guys. They go down the street, they want to try and take over Paarl.
Women too.
Women too, yeah.
No, there was a woman leader.
There, Comrades Adams.
Yeah.
So they were also violently suppressed by the police, but eventually a lot of people go into exile, and they set up operations in Tanzania. A lot of Mandela goes over to Algeria to get military training. But what it actually does is this, along with the oppression, it leaves a vacuum in the country. So from the 1960s, mid-60s, there's a vacuum. There's still struggle, but there's no organization. There's still struggle. And then, comrades, obviously, out of the vacuum, comrades mentioned Black Consciousness Movement. It emerges in the late 60s. They take up the stuff around education. And the state's trying to pass legislation or laws that say there must only be Afrikaans in black schools. That must be the medium of education. And BCM and the student wing take up a fight against that, but they're also fighting for better quality education. But they're fighting from the early 70s, late 60s and organizing. And it peaks in 1976 with the big Soweto riots, etc. And it spreads across the country. It's supported actually by white students from Wits even. So there's a whole mobilizing happening. It too was violently suppressed. But as comrades mentioned, another thing happens, the Durban strikes in 1973. So the same thing, fighting against a migrant wage system, fighting against pass laws, fighting against low wages. And out of this is a big strike. 70,000 workers in Durban go on strike, and they strike across factories, different factories. It starts at a company, Coro Brick. Anyone know what Coro Brick does? They still exist. They produce bricks. Yeah. So out of this starts emerging then, after this, different unions start emerging. So another big strike was in 1976 actually in East London. There was a really big strike that came out of that as well. And out of this, by the late 70s, because of struggle, the state decides that before 1973 all black trade unions were legal. You couldn't legally belong to a trade union as a black person. Out of struggle, they say the state has to give something. It says, fine, we will recognize black trade unions, but it was struggle. There was no struggle, that would have never happened. So they start winning gains. FOSATU becomes COSATU later on. But there's 1976, but 1976 erupts again, but it's not led by BCM, wasn't quite aligned with the ANC either. But in 1980 and 81, there's big protests. Specifically, they start in Cape Town in what people would term coloured working class areas. And they're also protesting against poor education. And it spreads right across coloured areas, and it eventually spreads to black or African areas. But the thing was that it actually happened at two different times. They tried to create solidarity amongst township across the working class. But what happened was what they termed coloured schools come out and strike. They boycott classes. They form a committee to try and coordinate the strike. But they also face heavy repression. And what happens is they decide that they're going to go back to school because they've been out on strike for months. And when they go back to school, the African schools actually came out. It didn't quite coincide, but it meant the state could maneuver. But out of this long struggle for education, eventually, the state in the 80s actually starts improving. It's not great, but they start improving education in townships. So it does improve. But it's only because there's struggle, and there's gains won out of this. They dump Afrikaans. They say, okay, fine, we're not going to try and impose Afrikaans in the schools. But that was because of struggle and mobilizing, and it has a very long history. So people build on struggles, and sometimes it's not consciously. But that long history of struggle is important. Then what happens also is the townships again erupt in 1984-85, and they start linking up with workers. And Tesh was mentioning this last week. There was strikes here in Cape Town by Fatties and Monies when the community supported, and they said the workers are on strike, we're going to boycott. In Joburg it went quite far. Some comrades started occupying their factories. So they didn't start production, but they went into the factories and they would stay there as part of their strike. And you had obviously, specifically around Port Elizabeth, people were setting up their own street committees. So during 1984-85, there was a big challenge to capitalism in the state. And out of that, apartheid starts collapsing. But as we mentioned last week, the state also tries repression, it tries reform, it does various things. But this long history of the struggle actually ends the pass laws, it ends the Group Areas Act. It starts denting migrant labour system, but it doesn't end it, as we can see from Marikana. And for the first time, especially in the 80s, black working class starts winning better wages. We mentioned last week how that is then attacked, and how we can see then new struggles start happening. So the comrades mentioned your own struggles. We have TAC formed because the state's not delivering antiretrovirals. Because remember, we looked at the transition last year, a lot of what happened in apartheid remains. The ruling class changes, but the working class still faces oppression. And we see equal education formed, SJC, fighting around sanitation. We also see fights against hate crime. But why is hate crime happening? Because the working class faces difficulties, and sometimes the working class blames other working class people for those difficulties. We see Maracana. We also see movements emerge in Joburg called the Anti-Privatization Forum. They were fighting against privatization of services like water. What the state was doing was they're selling stuff off. So the state used to provide water. And it was a long struggle to win that. But now they say, I will sell it to capitalists who can then sell water to make money. So there's a long fight. There's a long fight also. The state starts implementing cost recovery. So they don't want to provide stuff that in the 80s they were providing almost for free, like water, like sanitation. They want to make money back from it, cost recovery. The APF emerges out of that. The Comrades are something of anti-eviction campaign. If you remember.
Soweto Crisis Committee.
Yeah, Soweto Crisis Committee is part of the APF. There's a movement that emerged in Cape Town to put people back in their houses that were being evicted. It's gone now, but it emerged, and for a while it was quite strong, and then it disappears. So Comrades is a long history of struggle, and in many ways some of the struggles are different, but a lot of them are actually similar. So especially in the workplace, trying to win wages, trying to stop the migrant labour system on the mines. In townships, obviously, Comrades is the service delivery issues, but it goes long back. People were fighting for houses way back. People were fighting for better education way back. So it's important we remember this. But without that struggle, none of the gains would have ever been made. So the struggle is highly important. So that's why our history is important to know, because we're not actually alone. We're building on what people did in the past. And it's important to remember that. So I don't know if you want to add anything. Are there any questions? Or
Is there something about East London in 1976? I didn't get that.
yeah, there were big strikes in East London as well in 1976. So Durban happens first, and then workers later on in East London go on strike in 1976. But they're also like really big strikes, thousands of people out on strike.
Bus, round
Bus
tree
boycotts
factories,
as well, yeah.
round tree sweets as Wilson, as a workers of price around, yes.
Yeah, there was also a boycott around Wilson's. People said they're not buying Wilson's because the workers are on strike. So it's important. At times there's been links between even though workers live in the community, sometimes the workplace struggles don't link with the community struggles. When they do, it becomes strong. So you saw like 1984, 1985, they're linking up.
It's maybe worth mentioning that someone who's missing from the class today, Temba, is in Strand, Luandle, right now.
Yeah,
Did you hear that?
Yeah, there's.
Are you
Yeah. I don't know if you want to explain.
leading the anti-eviction
Yeah.
protest there?
So yeah, there's a long history. So Comrades are being evicted there by Strand now to make way for a highway. So yeah, there's a long history around land struggles, disposition of land, etc. They continue to today. So a lot of the struggles are the same, some are a bit different. You don't have past laws, we still face evictions, we still face land issues, we still face a migrant labour system, we still face poor quality housing struggles. Yeah. But there wouldn't be any gains unless there were struggles. So that's why organisations are highly important.